Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist here at American Compass, and today we are finally talking artificial intelligence. I didn't want to do artificial intelligence on the podcast because most of the people we would talk to about it are insufferable, but we have someone I was very excited to have a conversation with. His name is Colin Kahl. He was actually Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the start of the Biden administration and is now co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation and the inaugural Stephen C. Hasey Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and a professor of political science, all at Stanford University. Colin and I ran into each other actually at a couple of different conferences in recent months, and I just found him to be the person I was most interested in listening to and wanting to learn more from. So I thought I would bring him to all of you, and he was gracious enough to accept. I think it is a terrific conversation about really some of the things that the current AI debates are getting wrong, thinking about what does it actually mean to even win the race in AI? Is there such a thing as a frontier? What is good enough AI? What are the policy choices we actually have to make? Really enjoyed talking to him. Hope you'll enjoy listening to it. But before we get to that, let me tell you a little bit about what else is at Commonplace this week. A bunch of fun stuff. We had a great feature from Mike Lind on the legacy of William F. Buckley Jr. on the 100th anniversary of his birth. Buckley's, not Lind's. And what it would mean to actually promote a viable conservatism. And some great commentary. Batya Ungar-Sargon on Jeff Bezos's odd decision to platform only dead consensus neoliberalism at the Washington Post, I guess, as like a second Wall Street Journal editorial page junior sort of thing. And Chad Scudiere on Humphrey's Executor, which is really important Supreme Court precedent on independent agencies. So check all of that out. Of course, subscribe to Understanding America. We are continuing to rampage through the political landscape with wonderful commentary on Mondays and roundups on Fridays. So head on over to understandingamerica.co for that. But without further ado, here is Colin Kahl. And Colin Kahl joins us now. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
Really appreciate you making the time. We first encountered each other at a recent AI conference, and I at least was thinking like, now, like that guy knows what he's talking about. I want to talk to him some more. And so excited to do that. But why don't we start? I think probably helpful just jump in a little bit on your background. What brought you to the Biden administration, what you were doing there, and what you're doing now.
Sure. I have a doctorate in political science, but I like to say I'm neither a real doctor nor a real scientist.
My brother has a PhD in math. He says I'm a doctor, but not the kind that helps people.
Right. Same. I'm even less of a scientist, though, than your brother. So, no, I'm a political scientist at Stanford University, where I'm a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, specifically the Center for International Security and Cooperation. I run a program there that focuses on the intersection of emerging technologies like AI and international security and geopolitical issues. But as you mentioned, I served for 2.5 years in the Biden administration from April of 2021 through July of 2023. And I had served previously in the Obama administration, both at the Pentagon and at the White House. And in the Biden administration, I was the undersecretary for policy at the Pentagon, which is, depending on how you think of it, is the number 3 civilian at the Pentagon, but you're kind of the national security advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So I've kind of toggled back and forth in my career between the academy, where I've had teaching jobs at places like Georgetown and Stanford, and the policy world.
All right. And you are now focused mostly on AI and AI as it relates to national security challenges to some extent, as it relates to economic policy to the extent that we are in a race on the industrial front as well. I guess probably the best place to start is on your assessment. Everybody has their own view. What do you see as kind of the best way to understand where we are with AI and where we might be headed?
Sure. I mean, artificial intelligence is basically, it's been around for decades, and it's basically an effort to get machines to think like human beings or to think better than human beings. we're kind of living at a time of extraordinary acceleration in the progress of AI. It's worth remembering that it was only about 2.5 years ago when ChatGPT really became a household name in the fall of 2022. So, kind of all of the buzz and excitement and velocity around AI, I think, has really taken off since that time period. And most of the models that we, focus on in our conversations, which are sometimes called frontier AI models, are essentially generative AI models that are a combination of large language models that can produce text and multimodal models that can produce sound, video, images. And so, together you combine these into generative AI models that can do text, image, video, sound, computer code, and increasingly can generalize about the world. So think about models like ChatGPT or from OpenAI, or Claude from Anthropic, or the Gemini series of models from Google. You have Grok, which is xAI's model. And what really sets these models apart is the sheer amount of data and computing resources that have been used to train them, and the fact that they are kind of deep learning systems that have kind of neural networks that are meant to, in some ways, mimic the way that our brains work, but basically ingesting an enormous amount of data about the world and making sense of it in the way that you and I take in sensory inputs from our eyes and our ears and everything, and to make sense of the world. And in the last couple of years, these models have gotten really, really good at certain things. They can write very persuasive text. They can generate photorealistic images. They are becoming increasingly good at video. They are becoming almost superhuman in the ability to code, to create computer code. They're getting much better at math. They're getting much better at kind of problem solving in general. And over the last year, we've seen a new generation of models, so-called reasoning models, that take a little longer to think through complex problems, but are getting a lot better at solving very big, complex problems. And I think that's led a lot of people in the industry, and I don't mean just people at the head of companies who are trying to generate hype, but a lot of experts in the industry, to predict that sometime in the next, say, 2 to 10 years, we could see the emergence of something that scientists call artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And, there are lots of different definitions for artificial general intelligence, but basically you can think of these as AI systems that are as capable or better as the smartest human beings on the planet at a whole range of cognitive tasks. So think, math, science, engineering, biology, chemistry, physics, but also potentially in the social sciences and humanities. And people believe that AI is already transforming the world and can kind of envision ways in which artificial and general intelligence could be truly revolutionary.
Yeah,
and the last point I will make is that all of this is being overlaid at a time of profound geopolitical turmoil, where the two leading AI powers in the world are the United States and China. So it's not just that we're in the middle of this kind of technological revolution, but that it's being overlaid with an enormous kind of geopolitical and economic competition between the two leading powers in the world.
Right. And I was jumping in because I wanted to ask you about your point about AGI sort of, frankly, having either a lot of definitions or no particular definition, depending on how one looks at it. And something that I've been struck by in a lot of the conversations that I've seen on the subject is that you end up with a lot of definitions that, as you were just describing, essentially say there will be lots of things that computers can do better than humans, in a sense. But of course, there's also a way in which that's already true. I mean, even your calculator can do all sorts of things better than a human. At the other extreme, there are folks who sort of try to commit to the concept of AGI as truly, replicating human functioning in the world and being a more useful worker, in a sense. And so I'm curious both kind of how you think about it conceptually, and then also as a formal matter, what you think is the right definition to put on that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I think super smart people, including people who are much more intelligent about the nature of the technology than me, can disagree on the concept. But I think many of us encounter the notion of AGI or superintelligence through the movies, right? Like we think about it as like HAL 9000 or Skynet in the Terminator movies, or the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica, or maybe Samantha, the AI played by Scarlett Johansson in the movie Her. Most of those are pretty dystopian.
I was going to say, well, that all sounds great. Very exciting.
Yeah. But but when I think of AGI, I think of more of models that are as smarter than humans across a broad range of tasks, maybe not on everything, but on a huge range of tasks. And so, sometimes the analogy is made to, what if you had 1,000,000 geniuses in a data center, and those geniuses were the most brilliant minds in all of their fields. But it's not just that they were the most brilliant minds in their fields. They were the most brilliant minds across a whole range of fields, and were able to collaborate across them, never having to sleep at machine speed. That'd be a pretty big deal. So, even separate from kind of AGI in the science fiction sense of like an autonomous being, I think what we're approaching in the next few years are models that are better than the best humans at a whole range of cognitive tasks that are very relevant to the economy, science, the military, and therefore is likely to have a profound impact, even if once we get there, people still don't think of it as AGI, or people can't agree that it's AGI. There is a separate set of arguments about, across a certain threshold, the models will be so capable and so autonomous that they will basically start to recursively self-improve.
Right.
So you get this like takeoff to superintelligence, almost like a godlike superintelligence, as the model just improves itself. And I think there some of the biggest concerns are a loss of control, essentially, over what the model is doing, the interests and values that the model is aligned around, and what that means for like the human race when we're no longer the smartest entity on the planet. But I think we're probably pretty far away from that, but we're not that far away from models that are as good or better than humans in a whole range of really important areas.
Sure. And so, you mentioned kind of all the different ways that matters. One of them obviously is national security. And, particularly when it comes then to the competition between between the US and China, there's an element of just, well, it's cool to be first, and you get lots of great stuff, but the implication is that there are real geopolitical and national security implications to it. Are there particular scenarios that you sort of find most compelling, or a kind of particular use case that you think puts the best point on, okay, why is this a national security issue? What are we scared of, in a sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you can kind of think about it in terms of the implications of artificial intelligence for the geopolitical balance, or the balance of power, and in particular, the balance of power between the United States and China as the two most influential countries in the world. You can think of it in that sense. And then you can also think of it in terms of the threats, the national security threats that AI might produce, by the way, that could be equally inflicted upon the United States, China, and other countries. So let me take those kind of in turn. So in terms of the geopolitical balance, I think we're already seeing AI being applied in a whole range of national security applications in terms of the military and intelligence. But really what you're looking at are artificial intelligence models that are integrated into national security platforms in ways that improve the quality of how we sense the environment, but also improve the way in which we make sense of the environment. That is, are able to connect dots from all of the data and information that we are hoovering up. So think of satellite imagery or drone video, or emails that are being read, or other communications that are being intercepted, and being able to put it all into the AI calculator and to produce a holistic picture of a battlefield in a wartime context, or just an intelligence picture to help you day to day understand the world. You also have AI applications in the form of autonomous systems. So think of the drones that came to prominence during the so-called global war on terrorism, but increasingly in places like Ukraine, you're seeing drones and loitering munitions that have autonomous or semi-autonomous capabilities. That is, they can make certain decisions on the battlefield without being directed by a human operator. And I think there's a lot of emphasis in both the United States and China on the possibility of having increasingly autonomous systems. And the reason that militaries are driven in that direction is that it's actually becoming increasingly difficult to communicate reliably on the battlefield because of electronic warfare and jamming of satellites and other things. So essentially letting uncrewed systems or drones do it themselves is a way to generate military effects even when a human operator can't communicate with the drone. And so you're seeing, in the U.S. Initiative called Replicator, for example, a major theory of how you deter China from invading Taiwan is to have thousands of low-cost, attritable, autonomous drones that can swarm and defeat an amphibious landing of Taiwan, for example. And then there are other more banal but important applications, like using AI to manage personnel or to manage logistics or to manage training. Or to help with planning. And then day to day, you can envision artificial intelligence essentially as agents and advisors. So just like a military commander might have a military lawyer or an operations advisor or a planner, they will also have an AI agent that provides insight and decision-making support. So the idea is that, the country that innovates and integrates those technologies into its military most effectively will have meaningful advantages. And some of those advantages could come in areas where machine speed is particularly important, especially in the cyber domain, right? Where you can imagine AI helping with both cyber offense and defense, which is increasingly important to warfare. So that's kind of one bucket of essentially what are the national security applications that the United States and China are racing around to improve their military and intelligence apparatus.
Right. And so it seems like even within that, there are kind of two buckets. One is basically it's a weapons just like any development of weapons platforms, these are new weapons that would potentially alter the shape of a battlefield. And then the second is sort of as a process matter, having good command of AI means being able to do things. A few centuries ago, knowing how to kind of march in a column and then deploy quickly out into a line was the dominant technological innovation. This is essentially another way of amplifying the effectiveness of a fighting force.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. Look, I'll turn on my Pentagon geek hat a little bit. The way the U.S. military talks about the applications most commonly is in terms of the so-called OODA loop, right? Which is observe, orient, decide, and act, which is kind of the loop that military commanders and operators engage in. So observe means seeing the battlefield, orienting means understanding the battlefield, deciding means deciding what you're going to do, and acting means carrying it out. And there are ways in which AI will be plugged into that entire loop. And then there will also just be enterprise applications of like, how do you train your forces? How do you provide healthcare to them? How do you provide logistics? How do you do maintenance? And so but AI is being contemplated as being integrated in all of those pieces. And so some people call AI a dual use technology. Other people call it a general purpose technology, kind of like electricity. And I think whether it's dual or general, it'll have wide applications and is already starting to have that in the U.S. Military and in the Chinese military. And so who wins the race matters for the military balance. Yeah. Let's just put it that way. The other piece of this, of course, geopolitically, is the effect it has on economic productivity and your economic dominance and the role that plays in the geopolitical competition. Okay, so that's bucket one. The second bucket, though, is really the threat side of it. And this is really about the threat of the diffusion and proliferation of dangerous AI capabilities. And so here, there's kind of a sense of concern around a number of things. One is that the AI models are getting super good at coding. And as a consequence, what are the implications for kind of democratizing the ability to create very dangerous cyber weapons to enable people to hack into electricity grids or bring down the stock market or engage in widespread cybercrime or go after critical infrastructure that's connected to the internet. And just allowing not just very well-resourced state actors to do that, but just some dude in a basement somewhere, the ability to kind of co-pilot with AI to create some very devastating cyber weapon. There's a lot of concern on the bioweapons side of not only kind of pulling together all the information on bioweapons that's available on the internet, but increasingly being able to design novel pathogens that could set in motion a pandemic that could kill millions or more people. There are other concerns people have about other weapons of mass destruction. Then there's the kind of the implications for democracy, right? The ability to use AI algorithms to engage in very effective campaigns of persuasion, to include misinformation and disinformation campaigns that destabilize societies, period, but in particular, democracies. And then there's the rogue AI problem itself, which is you create super intelligent systems and you lose control of them. That's the kind of Skynet, HAL 9000 problem. And I would say that when people have the national security conversations, they're holding these two things in their mind of like, what is the way in which AI makes our country more powerful? And what are the things that we fear losing control over that could really do harm to our country? And the challenge is that one imperative forces you to race to be first, and the other, it creates an incentive to try to hold back for safety reasons. And so there's an inherent tension between managing the national security implications of those two buckets.
Right. So I want to jump further into the kind of the race dynamic of it all, and what it means for policy. But first, just one further question on kind of the battlefield or landscape in a sense. You know, you'd referenced the kind of million geniuses in a data center somewhere. That strikes me as different or more powerful than a lot of the examples we were just talking through, which are in a sense, frankly, things that the AI, LLMs already being delivered, maybe they'll keep getting better, but could kind of already do. I'm curious what if you think the march toward the geniuses in a data center is essentially more of the same, or if there's also a kind of new or different type of balance of power implication that starts to bring forward.
I think it is. I think it is meaningfully different, and perhaps non-linearly so, because it's one thing to have AI models that are good at a particular thing, but AI models that are good at a large number of things, and in fact so good that they are as good or better than the best humans, and especially across a range of STEM fields, could generate scientific breakthroughs, like new technologies that don't currently exist, new ways to think about everything from how you conduct manufacturing to how you design aspects of synthetic biology to fields of science maybe that we haven't even thought about. And then the question becomes how you translate those science and technology breakthroughs into actual power. So it's one thing to theorize about a nuclear weapon. It's another thing to actually build a nuclear bomb, right? And I think one of the questions about the AI race is that if you ask me, like, who is currently at the frontier of AI, it's clearly American companies. I mean, we can debate about whether they're 6 months ahead or 2 years ahead. And I think in the aftermath of kind of the freak out over DeepSeek, people would say they're closer to 6 months ahead than 2 years ahead. But the American companies are ahead at the frontier. But China's really good at building stuff. And so I think one scenario that national security practitioners in the United States have to consider is that an American company could be the first to cross whatever threshold of capability you think of at the frontier, to include up to and including artificial general intelligence. And China could fast follow, but ultimately be a much quicker to adopt and integrate the technologies into their national security apparatus or diffuse throughout their economy. And most importantly, to the degree that, or at least as importantly, to the degree that science and technology breakthroughs that are enabled by AI require you to actually make things in the real world, whether it's a missile or a new factory or a new pharmaceutical application, you actually have to be able to build it. And one place where China is clearly ahead of the United States is in raw industrial capacity, and they are also ahead of us in terms of dominance over a lot of critical supply chains that go into manufacturing. And so one of the things that I worry about is that the United States or U.S. companies could stay ahead at the frontier. China will be a fast follower and then a much and then ultimately much quicker in executing and building up and scaling breakthrough capabilities just because of their raw industrial might.
Right. And so this is the question about sort of the actual nature of the race that I think is so fascinating, and that, I heard you speaking about, and then you had a wonderful piece for Foreign Affairs that we will feature in the show notes as well on this topic, that most of the dialogue today talks about the race in terms of the frontier AI model training, right? Who's ahead in compute, who's ahead in data, who's ahead in algorithms. And to your point, data is a little more interesting, certainly in terms of the cutting edge chips, in terms of the best models. The US is ahead. But in a sense, those are also the things that are easiest to copy. And before the end, we should talk a little bit about export controls, which it's an interesting element, but certainly a lesson from DeepSeek is you're not going to keep how you designed the model and trained it a secret for very long. And so the argument I take you to be making, which strikes me as correct, is that the dimensions of the race that are actually relevant to who wins, in a sense, maybe there's some sort of tortoise and hare metaphor here, isn't who trains the frontier model best and first. It's who can both scale up upstream, in other words, build the biggest data centers and the biggest power plants the fastest, and then who can scale up downstream in terms of actually deploying this stuff, whether that's from a management perspective, from a building and manufacturing perspective. And is it fair to say it's hard to see where, if anywhere, the U.S. is ahead in the upstream and downstream elements of all that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are certain places where the U.S. is clearly ahead. So if we define the AI race in terms of innovation, like where you are on the frontier, the best models in the world continue to be American models. And yeah, DeepSeek, both the V3 model, which is essentially kind of a version of ChatGPT 4.0, and then the R1 reasoning model, which is kind of a version of ChatGPT 01. Yeah, I mean, the DeepSeek model is really good. But there are better models already out in the world, and there are proprietary models that have not been released by the leading companies that are out in the world. It's also the case that DeepSeek basically leveraged a bunch of open source models that were released predominantly by Meta, and also appears to have distilled certain results from OpenAI's models. But and they also appear to have stockpiled thousands of NVIDIA chips, either before the export controls kicked in to constrain their access to them, or otherwise got their hands on them. But it still proves that they can be pretty fast, and they can do it much more cheaply. And so, okay, let's say they're 6 or 9 months behind. The question becomes then, is there a compounding advantage to getting across some threshold, right? So there are some proponents of AGI that say at a certain point, especially when the models become better than the best machine learning engineers in the world, that once you get across that threshold, the model will just recursively self-improve itself such that it is always better than second place. Okay, that's one scenario. I'm doubtful, but that's possible. Another scenario is that you stay ahead because even if China can copy the models increasingly will consume large amounts of compute, not to train, although that is also the case, but to run inference, that is to actually answer queries to the model. Yeah. And what you've seen in the last several months is a real shift in the paradigm to the kind of away from the kind of instantaneous response of the model to it goes away and thinks about things for 5 minutes and then comes back to you with the answer. And that, what's called time test compute, that also takes a lot of computing power. So maybe the United States is ahead at the innovation, in terms of innovation, and we just have a lot more compute because of the export controls. And so maybe we're ahead in those two things. But there's another way in which say, okay, we're ahead, but maybe it's only ahead by 6 to 12 months. And China will be able to develop models that are still pretty good. In fact, maybe good enough for most commercial applications. And then China will just be better at a bunch of other things. They'll be better at diffusing the models. So DeepSeek, for example, is a very good model, but it's also an open source model. So it is diffused really quickly and it's very cheap. And so, yeah, maybe it's not the Cadillac. Maybe it's more of like, the Toyota Corolla or something. But like, if it's a lot cheaper and a lot more widely available, that may be enough to dominate the car industry. So they're kind of flooding the zone with these good enough open source models. China's also really good at pairing artificial intelligence historically with forms of digital infrastructure. So that could be basic infrastructure like telecommunications and internet connectivity or electricity, or it could be data centers and cloud services. And China's just invested a lot more in kind of creating that vertical digital stack than the United States has historically. And so if you combine good enough models with China's ability to basically diffuse the models and the associated technology much more widely, the US could win the race across the frontier and still essentially lose the global competition for who kind of controls the global ecosystem around AI.
Right.
That's one way we lose the race. Second way we lose the race is that China's government has invested a lot more in building up compute capacity that's available to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army than the United States has invested in compute capacity that's available to the U.S. government, which means that the Chinese state may be much quicker to integrate and adopt these technologies for game-changing purposes. And then the last is what we talked about a couple minutes ago, which is the industrial capacity piece, which is to the degree that these models require you to actually produce things in the real world to generate effects, China can produce things at scale in the real world faster than we can, whether it's ships or missiles or power plants or whatever. So that's what I worry about. I'm quite convinced that a U.S. company will be first across the frontier to whatever we consider to be the threshold for AGI. And I'm not at all convinced that the United States will beat China along almost any of those other dimensions.
Right. And the good enough, it seems to me there's sort of two implications of the good enough AI. One that we haven't talked about as much thus far, but seems very important to me, is the kind of global ecosystem point. That there is we've been talking about this in a very bilateral context, but there is also the bigger picture. Okay, it's, we all have lived through the internet era, which was a set of Western technologies. Like, sure, CERN was cute, but basically it was a U.S. Dominated and dictated framework and system. There's no reason to believe that whatever emerges economically, geopolitically out of AI is going to be a set of US-led systems and institutions if the US is sort of focused on its precious frontier stuff and China has an open source good enough model backed with a low interest loan to whoever adopts that stack first. And my sense is that's sort of already starting to happen. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is just that China has a global strategy around AI that the United States doesn't match. Okay, so, a couple years ago, Xi Jinping rolled out the Global AI Governance Initiative as one of the big initiatives alongside Beijing's Global Development Initiative, their Global Security Initiative, and their Global Civilization Initiative. And so think about this as that AI is one of the four legs of this kind of grand strategic vision about how China will exercise influence around the world. So that's thing one. Thing two is, as we've already talked about, Chinese companies, including companies that are more compute starved, have proven to be relatively fast followers. So they're gonna have decent models, maybe not the very best, but pretty good. And they're going to be much more inclined, at least for some period of time, to open source them to facilitate diffusion. We also know that China is very good at narrower applications of AI. So think about like facial recognition, computer vision applications, or data analytics. And we know that China for years, as part of its Belt and Road Initiative and Digital Silk Road Initiative, has sponsored the building of smart cities or safe cities around the world, which basically link narrower AI models with surveillance capabilities to, in essence, allow governments to deliver more efficient services, but also to spy on their people and do other things, especially in authoritarian countries. And then big Chinese tech companies collude with the Chinese government to provide relatively inexpensive infrastructure. So telecommunications networks, broadband internet, data centers, cloud services. And even though like 70% of global cloud services are provided by US companies, so think of like Google Cloud, AWS, Microsoft Azure. 30% are provided by companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Huawei, and they're making a major play to expand the role of those cloud computing services and the AI applications that come with them across Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. And so China has a plan and they're moving out on it. And, I worry about this from an American perspective because what we know from Chinese models is that they embed certain values of the Chinese Communist Party. And what do I mean by that? Censorship, like try asking it about Tiananmen Square or things about Winnie the Pooh because of jokes about Xi Jinping or like the Uyghurs or Taiwan or Tibet, and you'll get really weird answers or simply they won't answer the question. There's also a heavy dose of surveillance and the possibility for mass propaganda, which China is already engaged in around the world through various means. And then when you layer on top of that the fact that these models could be running on Chinese infrastructure where all that data is going back to Beijing to be number crunched for the purposes of expanding China's influence or their ability to conduct influence operations around the world or to spy on people or what have you. And I think it matters very much for the United States, whether it's kind of a US or democratic anchored AI ecosystem that ultimately comes to define the new age or a Chinese one. And right now, the paradox is like we're ahead at the frontier and China is ahead at constructing this ecosystem that is much more aligned with digital authoritarianism than democracy.
Right. And so to wrap up on the policy front, if we think about the race in these terms, I think it points to some different priorities for, first of all, getting ahead and second of all, staying ahead. The one place where there has been focus, I'm curious what you think of it, is on export controls. And is that a futile pursuit, something that is actually working pretty well, or something that could work and needs to work, but needs to be gone about differently?
Yeah, I mean, there are aspects of all of the above.
Fair enough.
I think the way that I would say it is that if in terms of a comprehensive strategy for competing on AI and achieving our national objectives, in all the ways that we've talked about so far in this podcast, export controls are a necessary but not sufficient condition. So there's no question that by limiting China's ability to access high-end chips like A100s and H100s made by NVIDIA, let alone the new Blackwell chips, or other kind of high-end AI accelerators, that we're holding companies back in China. The DeepSeek CEO has admitted that one of their biggest challenges is they don't have enough access to chips, right? So, is it a panacea? It is not. But is it making life harder for Chinese companies? Yes. And that gives the United States an edge, at least for some period of time. Then the question is like, what do we make? Like, what do we make of that time? But I mean, obviously export controls can encourage indigenization and they can encourage innovation. And we're seeing both of those things in China. But the only thing worse than the export controls would be to lift the export controls and flood China with unlimited numbers of leading edge NVIDIA chips. Like the DeepSeek guys, let alone the CCP mandarins, would be salivating at the prospect of China getting unlimited chips. So what we need to do is continue to make adjustments. The Biden administration built on the restrictions that the Trump administration put in place on chip making equipment, like lithography machines from ASML and other chip making tools, started to ban certain types of chips. When companies like NVIDIA kind of downgraded, but not that much, the chips, the export controls had to be updated to adjust to how the companies adjusted to it. And there have now been kind of 3 or 4 iterations, starting in 2022 through the current period. On the way out the door, the Biden administration also rolled out a big diffusion framework for AI that basically was trying to create a global framework of how to control where chips go so that China couldn't access the chips remotely in places like the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Malaysia or places like that, while also kind of constructing an incentive structure that encouraged AI development at the frontier to happen predominantly in the United States and our allies, and also to happen through so-called validated end users, which is basically large American hyperscalers, cloud companies that can monitor how the training is being done, how the models are being used, and make sure that stuff doesn't get diverted to China. So all that framework, I think, is, we can twiddle the knobs, And clearly, we're going to have to adapt as China adapts. But I don't think throwing it out makes any sense, even if, even if it's not a panacea. But it does have to be supplemented with the things that address all the other issues we've been talking about, Oren, or we're going to lose, even if we win. Like if we don't invest enough in government compute, then it won't matter because China will apply AI models faster than the U.S. government for national security purposes. If we don't invest in the infrastructure here and around the world required to train and run AI models and provide the benefits of those models, then China will do those things. And they may not be as good as ours, but they'll be good enough. And that's where I have the biggest, I think, criticism or the biggest shortfalling of U.S. policy is that we haven't invested enough in that. And one concern I have, we'll see. One concern I have about some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration is I understand why they are leaning into the innovation and deregulation piece. And we can, people can debate about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm fine with running fast as long as there's certain, guardrails around it. But the reality is that market forces alone are not going to solve this problem because China's not playing by the rules. So the Trump folks also have to come up with a global offering of AI, or they could see us dominate here at home only to lose out to China around the world.
Right. And this is one thing that I find just so fascinating about the discussion, the way now this sort of AI topic ends up merging back into so much of the work we do at American Compass, so much of the kind of broader political economy debates going on in the US and the West is this exact idea that, well, if China is going to behave the way China behaves, then markets aren't actually going to function the way that the whiteboards say they should. And, obviously we've seen that in the trade context. I think you just described what that means for AI as well. One place where these then sort of intersect is on the idea of reindustrialization. And what do you do to have not just markets that are rewarding AI development in the right ways, but rewarding bending the pieces of metal and generating the power and having the ability to adapt manufacturing to new products quickly and so forth. Is there, there is already a sort of general push in that direction now as a matter of economic policy. I guess last question for you is, laying the AI lens on top of that, are there particular priorities? Obviously chips has already been a priority even independent of AI. Is there particular kinds of things or particular industries or market policies that you think are kind of the most important ones with the AI hat on?
Yeah, a lot of these will be familiar to your listeners. I think there need to continue. Look, the problem is not money, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars are being thrown at the compute problem here in the United States, or the need to build up more compute. The challenge, of course, are things like land, water, and energy. And there was an executive order at the end of the Biden administration that started to chip away at some of these things in terms of thinking about the use of federal land. I'm sure the Trump administration is going to do more on kind of permitting reform and the types of energy resources that can be used to build these gigantic data centers. And, just for some of your listeners, when OpenAI and SoftBank and Oracle rolled out Stargate and the notion of spending between $100 and $500 billion on these data center clusters to train AI in the United States. At the high end, some of these clusters could use 5 gigawatts of power, right, which is the equivalent of what Los Angeles uses, right? Like this is like an insane amount of power. So
you're going to need some nuclear power plants right next door, I'm pretty sure.
You're going to need a lot of stuff. And that's going to require a lot of collaboration between the public sector and the private sector to be able to build that type of infrastructure at scale. I would argue we would also probably want to do it in a way that doesn't completely destroy the environment and doing some other things. But nevertheless, regardless of what it looks like, it's going to require a lot of public-private partnership. So that has to be a major source of focus for the Trump administration. I do think there just needs to be a broader investment in our industrial base that has nothing to do with AI, but where you could actually translate some of the breakthroughs from AI into the real world. On the military side, of course, that the war in Ukraine has kind of demonstrated that the U.S. defense industrial base is not fit for purpose. And so we need to continue to make massive investments in that industrial base. That's shipbuilding, but also the ability to create large numbers of uncrewed systems and other things.
And being able to build the machine tools that are going to build the uncrewed systems, in fact.
Yeah, and train the people who build the machines. Like there's a whole, this is a all hands on deck. And also making sure that the supply chains for all those things you do build don't ultimately also go back to China. Right. It's become really hard, for example, for American drone companies to build drones because all the supply chains go back to China one way or another. So that industrial base piece is non-trivial. It's huge. I would also, I think a big point of emphasis that isn't talked about quite as much is also on the biomanufacturing side, because I think you're likely to see a lot of breakthroughs in terms of biomanufacturing, and not just in like pharmaceuticals or whatever, but materials or energetics, fuels. And I'm not at all convinced that the United States has the capacity to scale up that type of biomanufacturing. And again, I think China is better positioned than we are in that way. So those are the types of investments. And then there's the international piece where, look, I mean, I'm not going to gaslight people and tell them that like the Trump administration is going to be big on foreign assistance when they're dismantling USAID, right? But they did do things in the first Trump administration, like standing up the Development Finance Corporation and using other tools that are not about foreign aid in the way that we think about it as like a grant or charity or humanitarian, but rather using relatively modest amounts of public capital to unlock enormous amounts of private capital in foreign countries that serve American interests. And so if there are market failures, which are leading companies like Microsoft or Google to underinvest in certain countries, then how do we unlock the investments to get them to do that in a way that will, make our companies money, but also help us compete for influence with China? Those are the types of things that I hope this administration will focus on, even as it kind of casts a skeptical eye on development tools in general. I do think there is an argument from a China competition lens to be a lot more forward-leaning in the global South in partnering with the private sector on these AI and infrastructure issues.
Yeah. Well, no shortage of projects and policy initiatives in every possible area. We will have to leave things there for now, but that has given us more than enough to think about. This has been fantastic. Colin Kahl, thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, great to be with you.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.